There are things Laurie told Rick, there are things she told Shane, and then there are things she never told either of them, things she carried alone from the moment the world ended until the moment she died in a prison boiler room, asking Maggie to cut her open with a knife and nothing else. The affair and what actually preceded it, the pregnancy, and the secret attempt to end it before immediately reversing course, the paternity question she carried for 9 months without answering out loud to anyone, the sexual assault at the CDC that she chose, deliberately and with clear reasoning, never to report, the kill order she whispered into her husband's ear in season 2 and then seemed to walk back completely 5 episodes later, and the final secret she gave to Carl with her dying breath, 2 sentences that became the moral foundation for the rest of his life. Laurie Grimes was the most secretive character in the entire Walking Dead universe. The show built its first 2 seasons almost entirely around the consequences of what she concealed, and then gave her one of the most emotionally devastating death scenes in the show's history, and then sent the audience away, still arguing about whether any of it made her sympathetic or whether she was simply a poorly written mess of contradictions. Tonight we're going through all of it, slowly and completely. We're going to start at the very beginning before the first walker rose, because nothing Laurie did in the apocalypse makes full sense without understanding who she was before it. We're going to track every secret in sequence, examine what she knew when she knew it, sit with the choices she made and the context she made them in. And by the end, I want to give you a version of this character that is more complete than the one the show's editing sometimes allowed for. Get comfortable. This one takes a while. To understand what Laurie hid and why, you have to start with what she had before the world ended. Because the affair that defined her entire arc, the one the fandom used to condemn her for the rest of the show's run, didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from a marriage that was already quietly losing air. The show tells you this in the pilot episode, and it tells you in the first 5 minutes. Before you know any of these people, or have any reason to track what you're being shown, Rick and Shane are sitting in their patrol car eating lunch, and Rick is sharing something personal in the embarrassed way that people share things they're not entirely comfortable naming. He tells Shane that something is wrong at home, that whenever he tries to talk to Laurie, whatever he says comes out wrong, that she's become impatient with him in a way she can't quite articulate, that she's angry, and he doesn't know why, that the distance between them is palpable, and neither of them has found a way to address it. Then he tells Shane what she said to him that morning, in front of Carl, that sometimes she wonders if he even cares about them at all. This is the marriage before the apocalypse. Not a bad marriage. Not one defined by cruelty or contempt, but a strained one. A marriage between 2 people who had clearly stopped reaching each other, who had settled into the particular domestic distance that accumulates slowly and invisibly when people stop tending to each other. Rick emotionally withdrawn, his attention absorbed by the work. Laurie left managing the household and the child, and the loneliness of feeling peripheral in her own family. Neither of them villains. Both of them failing each other in the ordinary human ways that don't make for good stories, but are the most common reason marriages fall apart. Season 2 gives you a second piece of this in a flashback, at the beginning of episode 2. The morning Rick was shot, Laurie is standing outside Carl's school talking to her friend Paula, the only friend we ever see Laurie have in the whole run of the show. She admits to Paula that sometimes she wonders if she even loves her husband anymore. That is the last thought Laurie has about Rick in the world as it was. Not anger, not contempt, just the quiet, honest doubt of a woman who has been lonely inside her marriage for long enough that she has started to question the marriage itself. And then Shane pulls up in his cruiser with the news that Rick has been shot, and the old world ends, and everything after is the apocalypse. These moments matter because they establish that Laurie was not simply a faithful wife who betrayed her husband for superficial reasons. She was a woman in a failing marriage whose husband then apparently died. The arithmetic of what came next is not pleasant, but it is comprehensible. The foundational lie of the entire series is not something Laurie did. It is something that was done to her by a man who believed what he was saying. When the outbreak began, Shane went to the hospital where Rick was lying in a coma. He went to get Rick out. The season 1 finale shows us this in a flashback. Shane running through a hospital corridor that was already coming apart around him. Soldiers firing on patients, the facility in full collapse. He reached Rick's room. He pressed his ear to Rick's chest in a hallway that was full of gunfire and screaming, and he heard nothing, or couldn't hear anything over the surrounding chaos, and he made a decision. He barricaded Rick's door with a hospital gurney, perhaps to buy him time if he was alive, perhaps simply because he was already thinking about escape, and his body was doing things before his mind caught up. And then he left. He gathered Laurie and Carl and whatever other survivors he could find and got them out of King County toward Atlanta. Robert Kirkman was very clear about this in his commentary and in interviews. Shane genuinely believed Rick was dead. The flashback scene is structured specifically to show you that. He was not lying to steal Laurie. He was a man in an extreme situation, making an assessment under conditions that made accurate assessment nearly impossible. And he got it wrong. He told Laurie what he believed to be true. This matters enormously for evaluating everything that comes after. Laurie made the choices she made in the weeks that followed based on information she had every reason to trust. The man who had been her husband's partner, who had been woven into the fabric of her family for years, who had no obvious motive to lie to her, told her that Rick was dead. She had no way to verify this independently. She watched Atlanta burn from a distance. She accepted the death the way people accept deaths they didn't witness, in the slow, reluctant way, over time, because there is no other mechanism. During those weeks, she and Shane became involved. The show places us into this relationship in progress in the very first episode, before Rick has found the camp. Laurie slips away from Carl and Dale under the pretense of gathering mushrooms and meets Shane in the woods. She's wearing Rick's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. She never removed it from her person, even as she was physically moving on. The ring on the chain is the show's most compact summary of who Laurie was in this period. A woman who hadn't let go, who was going through motions of moving forward while still holding on to what was behind her. The affair was not the choice of a woman who stopped loving her husband. It was the choice of a woman who believed her husband was dead, who was frightened and grieving, and dependent on the person who had kept her and her son alive, and who eventually allowed grief and proximity and survival instinct to collapse into something she hadn't planned. It ended the moment Rick walked into camp. This is the piece of Laurie's story that receives the least attention in fan discussions, and it may be the most consequential. In the season 1 finale, the group reaches the CDC. They are given shelter and hot meals and functioning showers for the first time since the world ended. They drink heavily and watch Jenna's brain scan of his wife dying from the infection. And then Jenna locks them in the facility because he has decided the human race isn't worth continuing. During the chaos of people trying to break out and survive, Shane pulled Laurie into a darkened room. He was drunk and desperate, and had apparently decided that if they were all about to die, he needed to say the things he had been carrying. He told her their relationship was real, that she knew it was real. He insisted. And when Laurie tried to leave, he grabbed her and held her, and attempted to force himself on her. Laurie fought back. She scratched long, deep gashes into his neck in the struggle. She got away. The next morning, T-Dog noticed the marks on Shane's neck and asked about them. Shane said he'd done it to himself in his sleep. He looked at Laurie when he said it. The message was clear, and she received it. She never told anyone what happened. Think carefully about what that silence cost over the 2 seasons that followed. If Laurie had told Rick about the assault at any point, the entire trajectory of the Shane problem changes. Rick would have had clear and unambiguous reason to treat Shane as a threat rather than a troubled but loyal friend. The sustained ambiguity of Season 2, the constant question of how dangerous Shane actually was, whether Dale's warnings were paranoia or perception, all of that resolves differently if Rick knows that Shane assaulted his wife and then threatened her silence. But Laurie couldn't tell Rick without explaining the context, and the context was the affair. And the affair was information she was not ready to deliver. She was protecting the marriage she still had by concealing the violation she had survived, and that protection came at a cost that accumulated across 2 seasons. She was trapped in a very specific way. The assault was hidden inside the affair was hidden inside the grief, and the grief was hidden inside the marriage she was trying to reassemble. She couldn't pull one thread without the others coming with it, and she wasn't ready to let all of it unravel at once. Laurie discovered she was pregnant in Season 2, Episode 4, the episode called Cherokee Rose. She had been feeling unwell while the group searched for the missing Sophia, and while Carl recovered from the gunshot wound, and she suspected what it meant. She asked Glenn quietly, with the particular precision of someone who has thought carefully about how to ask without asking, to bring her something specific from the next pharmacy run. Glenn came back with a pregnancy test, and in one of the show's stranger comedic beats, a box of condoms as cover, which Maggie found immediately and interrogated him about. Laurie waited until the camp was quiet, went out into the dark alone, took the test, and sat on the ground with the result and cried. The paternity question is the thing that makes this pregnancy impossible to process cleanly for anyone involved. Robert Kirkman addressed it directly and without ambiguity. Laurie was with Shane for weeks before Rick returned, and then with Rick shortly after. The timing meant the father could be either man. When Laurie later told Dale that the baby was Rick's, Kirkman called that wishful thinking in his commentary. Andrew Lincoln confirmed in a 2018 interview that in the television canon, Shane is Judith's biological father. Laurie understood the arithmetic well enough to know the probabilities. She almost certainly knew on some level that the easier answer was the wrong one, and she carried that knowledge alone, in addition to everything else she was carrying. She kept the pregnancy secret from everyone initially. Not from Rick, not from Shane, not from Herschel. She went to Glenn, who was functionally a peer rather than an authority figure in the group, because she needed someone who would bring her what she asked for without immediately looping in Rick or anyone else. She was buying time to make a decision alone, because in her experience of this world, decisions made with other people's input tended to become other people's decisions. She asked Glenn to bring her morning after pills. Maggie, who accompanied Glenn, was furious. She threw the pills at Laurie when they returned, angry in the specific way that people are angry when they believe someone is about to make a moral choice they disagree with. Glenn also brought prenatal vitamins. He laid both options in front of her without comment, which was either tremendous sensitivity or a complete abdication of emotional support depending on how you read him, and left Laurie standing in a field, holding both possibilities with no one to talk to about either of them. She swallowed several of the pills, and then, almost immediately, she ran outside and made herself vomit them up. The show framed this as a change of heart, and it was, but it was also medically incoherent in a way the producers acknowledged. Morning after pills are not abortion pills. They work by preventing implantation, not by terminating an existing pregnancy. By the time Laurie was taking them, they would have been ineffective regardless. The writers took deliberate creative license because they needed Laurie to make a choice and immediately unmake it, to dramatise the impossibility of her position. What the scene was actually about was conflict made physical. The reaching for one direction, the reversal, the inability to land cleanly on either side. She was a woman who couldn't decide whether to stay or go, in marriage and in parenthood both, and the pill sequence was the show giving that paralysis a body. Rick found the empty packaging in their tent. The confrontation that followed broke open everything that had been sealed. She confessed the pregnancy. She confessed the affair. She confessed the pills and the vomiting. All of it in one scene that the show had been methodically building toward for 2 full seasons. Rick's response was quiet and devastating in equal measure. He told her he had understood the affair almost from the moment he arrived in Atlanta. He had carried that knowledge silently. He was angry, but the anger was turned inward as much as outward, because punishing Lori for what she had done under the circumstances she had done, it seemed to him like the wrong use of the fury he was feeling. He asked her what she wanted him to say. Neither of them had a good answer. She later told Shane directly what the pregnancy meant for him. She told him that even if the baby was his, it would never be his. That there was nothing he could do to change that fact. She meant this as a final boundary, a closed door, a formal statement of his position relative to her and her child. What it functioned as was an accelerant poured onto a situation that was already burning. The reason that Conversation was so difficult to read charitably is that Lori wasn't wrong about any of the individual things she said, but the cumulative effect of saying all of them plainly to a man in Shane's deteriorating psychological state was predictable. She had been watching Shane's behaviour across 2 seasons of escalating possessiveness and erratic decision-making. She understood, better than almost anyone in the group, what he was becoming. And she chose to speak plainly to him rather than to manage the conversation the way you might manage a volatile and dangerous situation when you understand what you are dealing with. That refusal to manage him was its own statement. She was not going to soften the truth about his position in her life in order to protect his feelings or moderate his reactions. The choice was coherent, but the consequences landed on everyone around her, not just on Shane. The Conversation in Season 2, Episode 9 is the scene that permanently defined Lori's reputation with a large portion of the audience, and it deserves more careful examination than it usually receives. Rick had just come back from the bar in town where he had killed 2 living men who threatened the group. He was shaken in the specific way that people are shaken when they have done something they cannot uncategorize. He told Lori what had happened, and Lori, rather than offering him comfort or even a moment of processing space, leaned in close and said something that changed the trajectory of the season. She told Rick that Shane thinks she is his, that Shane believes the baby is his, that Shane has been saying Rick cannot protect them, that Rick is going to get them killed, and then she said it plainly. Shane is dangerous, Rick, and he will not stop. She had established seconds before this that Rick was a man who had just proven he was capable of killing people to protect what belonged to him. The implication required no interpretation. The Washington Post wrote at the time that Lori was clearly trying to convince her husband to kill Shane. The fan community branded her Lady Macbeth, and the name stuck. The hatred that had been building across 2 seasons crystallized into something definitive in that moment. The defense of this scene is more sympathetic than the condemnation, and also more structural. Everything Lori said about Shane in that conversation was true. He had assaulted her at the CDC. Dale had warned her directly in an earlier episode that he believed Shane had murdered Otis, sacrificing him to walkers to escape the high school during Carl's medical emergency. Dale told Lori plainly that Shane was going to kill someone else. Shane's behaviour throughout Season 2 had been escalating visibly towards something that everyone in the group could feel, and almost no one was naming. Lori named it. She just named it in a way that suggested her husband was the solution. Whether that framing was manipulation or an honest reading of the situation depends entirely on what you believe about her motivations, and the show made that question deliberately unanswerable, which is either very good character writing or very frustrating television depending on what you want from it. Then came the windmill scene, which broke whatever remaining patience many viewers still had. 5 episodes later, in Better Angels, Laurie sought Shane out and apologised to him. She told him she had made a mess of things, that she had put him and Rick at odds, that she didn't even know whose baby it was. She reached out to him with something that looked like genuine compassion or, depending on your interpretation of her, a final catastrophic moment of emotional ambivalence that reignited everything she had tried to put out. Mazzara acknowledged the effect directly. He said Laurie had put Rick and Shane in motion to kill each other. He was not exonerating the men, both of whom had agency in what followed. He was stating a fact about causality. Laurie's actions in those 2 scenes were part of the chain that ended with Shane dead in a field and Rick confessing it to her in the season 2 finale. Laurie's reaction to that confession is the scene that produced more divided commentary than almost any other moment in the show's run. She pulled away from Rick. She removed her hands from his body. She covered her mouth. She shoved him. She refused to be held. Mazzara explained what the production intended. Laurie's horror was not that Rick had killed Shane, but what killing Shane had done to Rick. Her fear was that she had watched her husband become the kind of man she had been afraid of, that the act of destroying the threat had somehow absorbed the threat into the man she loved, that Rick, who she had believed was fundamentally different from Shane, had used the same violence and was standing in front of her having used it, and she didn't know any more where the line was. The audience read it as hypocrisy. Callies and Mazzara read it as terror. Both readings live simultaneously in the scene, which is again either a success of character writing or a failure of clarity, and the show never resolved which one it was. By the time season 3 begins, Rick and Laurie have settled into a functional silence. They are keeping each other alive without warmth. They work alongside each other without intimacy. The distance is visible in every shared scene, physical and emotional, the particular gap that opens between people who have been through too much together and cannot find the language to close it. The show dramatises this but doesn't fully explain it. And what it doesn't explain is that the silence was partly Laurie's choice. Not from cruelty. From the specific privacy of someone who has learned that disclosure tends to make things worse, rather than better. She had told Rick about the affair. She had told him about the pregnancy. She had warned him about Shane. She had watched all of that information detonate in various ways and had not gotten back what she might have hoped for in exchange. The assault at the CDC she still had not disclosed. The full texture of what the weeks with Shane were actually like she had not described. The private fear about what labour and delivery, in a world with no medical care, actually meant for her, she was keeping to herself. This is the version of Laurie that the show struggled to fully dramatise, because it required interiority the editing didn't always allow for. She was doing her own work privately, in the spaces between scenes. She was a woman who processed things internally and shared selectively, and got read as cold or withholding or dishonest when what she was actually doing was managing information in the only way that had ever felt safe to her. What made the silence between them in season 3 different from the silence between them in the patrol car at the beginning of the story is that by season 3, both of them knew what was under it. In the pilot, the distance came from not knowing, from things unsaid because the right moment hadn't arrived. By season 3, the distance came from things said, from disclosures that had already happened and hadn't produced the repair either of them needed. The information was out and the marriage was still exactly as strained, which in some ways was harder than the information being hidden. At least while things were hidden, there was the possibility that clarity would help. By season 3 they had clarity, and it hadn't fixed anything, and both of them were living inside that fact. Rick was cold to Laurie throughout the early part of season 3, in a way that fans of his character sometimes justify and sometimes struggle with. He had processed the affair, he had accepted the baby, he had dealt with Shane, and he was still distant. Quora discussions about this aspect of the show reflect a genuine split in how viewers read him. Some see a man who has been through too much and is coping by shutting down. Others see a man punishing his wife for something she had done under circumstances that deserved more compassion. Both readings are probably partially right. Rick was doing both things simultaneously, and so was Laurie. In Season 3, Episode 2, she tells Rick something that functions as the closest she comes to a full accounting of herself and their situation. She tells him she knows she's been a bad wife. She tells him she's not winning any Mother of the Year awards. And then she tells him that not for 1 second does she believe there is malice in his heart. She was not asking for forgiveness in that moment. She was not performing contrition to get something back. She was giving him the true thing, which was that she believed he was a good person, doing terrible things in a terrible world, and that belief was not conditional on him being easy to be with or easy to be married to. She meant it and she said it cleanly, and then she went back to surviving. That scene has been read as manipulation by the segment of the audience that had given up on her. The simpler reading is that it was honest. She was a woman who had been loving a complicated man through complicated circumstances for years, who had made her own complicated choices, and was not pretending otherwise, and who was running low enough on time that she was starting to say the true things rather than the comfortable ones. She was 8 months pregnant in an active prison clearing operation. She was past the point where there was any value in managing impressions. She said what she meant. What makes the scene heartbreaking rather than simply sad is that Rick couldn't receive it. He acknowledged it and moved on. The distance between them held, which was not necessarily his failure or hers, but simply the reality of two people who had been through too much to find a quick path back to each other, in a world that wasn't giving them the time to find a slow path. Before the death scene, there is a quieter conversation that sets it up and almost never gets discussed. In Season 3, Episode 1, Seed, early in the episode, Laurie finds a moment alone with Herschel. She is visibly pregnant. The group has just taken a cell block of the prison, and there is a brief window of relative safety. And Laurie uses that window to say something she has been carrying for a while. She tells Herschel that if she turns after the baby is born, if she dies and reanimates, she needs him to put her down immediately. She says it with the calm of someone who has already worked through the contingency fully. She has done the math and she is presenting the conclusion rather than the calculation. Then she says the harder part. She tells him she doesn't know what will happen during the birth itself. She doesn't know if the baby will survive it. She doesn't know if she will survive it. She asks him what happens to a baby born to a mother who has turned, whether a baby can become infected in the womb, whether there is any scenario in which both of them make it through. Herschel doesn't have answers. No one does. But Laurie isn't asking for medical advice. She's naming the things she has been lying awake at night running through alone, because naming them to another human being makes them slightly less impossible to hold. She has not had this conversation with Rick. She is carrying the logistics of her own death and her baby's uncertain survival, and she is not sharing them with her husband because she has made a judgment, possibly correct, that adding these fears to the things Rick is already managing would not help either of them. She is absorbing the weight of that privately. This is the version of Laurie that keeps appearing in the corners of scenes if you're watching for her. The woman who does her own preparatory work without asking for credit or acknowledgement. The woman who has assessed her situation accurately and made peace with the worst version of it, quietly, so that the people around her don't have to do that work themselves. She never told Rick she had done this preparation. It was one more thing she carried alone. Season 3, Episode 4 is called Killer Within, and it contains the scene that, for many viewers, recontextualizes everything that came before it. Walkers breach the prison. In the chaos, Laurie, Carl and Maggie were separated from the rest of the group and took shelter in the boiler room below the prison. And Laurie went into labour. She had previously delivered Carl by caesarean section. Without that context, what followed might read as tragic coincidence. With it, it reads as a situation Laurie had already mapped. She knew what her body would and would not do under natural labour conditions. She knew what Maggie had available, which was Carl's knife and no training and no anaesthetic and no surgical setup. She understood immediately what this required. She looked at Maggie and told her to do it. What she said to Carl before Maggie began is the scene that, if you come to it with full context, rewrites her entire arc. She told him he was going to be fine. She told him he was going to beat this world. She told him he was smart and he was strong and he was so brave. She told him he had to do what was right. And then she said the specific thing. If it feels wrong, don't do it. If it feels easy, don't do it. Don't let the world spoil you. If it feels easy, don't do it. From a woman who did the easy thing, who leaned on the man who was present instead of grieving alone, who swallowed the pills and then immediately expelled them, who kept the assault secret because disclosure was harder than silence, who whispered a kill order and then issued an apology. Every choice the audience found most condemnable was a choice made toward the less painful option, and Laurie knew this about herself with a clarity she had never quite been able to say out loud until she was out of time. She was giving Carl the lesson she had taken the hardest possible route to learn. She was distilling 2 years of consequence into 2 sentences and pressing them into her son's hands before she left. She told him he was her sweet boy, that he was the best thing she ever did. She told Maggie she was ready. And as Maggie raised the knife and began, Laurie whispered, "Good night, love." She lost consciousness before the incision was complete. Judith was delivered alive. Carl, understanding what would happen if his mother's body was left, told Maggie to leave the room. She left. A single gunshot sounded from behind the closed door. Sarah Wayne Callies described Laurie's death as the only truly chosen death the show had produced at that point. Every other major death was imposed. Laurie's was elected. She saw the situation clearly and she made a choice, and the choice was her daughter's life over her own. The audience that had spent 2 seasons cataloguing her contradictions watched that scene and went quiet. The reactions across social media and fan forums in the days following were among the most emotionally unanimous the show ever generated. People who had written extensive posts about hating Laurie didn't celebrate her death. They sat with it. Carl carried her words forward for the rest of his arc. When he chose to shelter Sadiq against his father's wishes, the reasoning he gave was almost verbatim from the boiler room. He was doing what felt right, even though it wasn't easy. When he wrote letters to everyone he loved before his infection killed him, he was doing the emotionally hard thing, rather than the emotionally easy one. When he told Rick the future he wanted was one with peace, rather than one with victory, he was using the moral framework Laurie had handed him with her last breath. The show's most hated character raised its most thoughtful one. That's not a coincidence. It's the whole point of her arc, placed so quietly at the end that you could miss it if you were looking for something louder. The television version of Laurie is complicated and contested. The comic version is both simpler in construction and more brutal in execution. And Robert Kirkman has spent a significant number of pages in the deluxe edition commentaries acknowledging that he did not handle her well. In the comics, the affair was a single night. Not weeks, not a sustained relationship developing over an extended period of grief, but one encounter on the highway during the evacuation from Cynthiana, Kentucky to Atlanta, shown in a flashback in issue 7. Laurie was consumed by fear and grief and proximity. She and Shane were together once. She regretted it immediately and completely. Shane died in issue 6, the final issue of the first collected volume, when Carl shot him in the neck with a handgun after Shane pulled a weapon on Rick in the woods. The love triangle lasted 6 issues. After Shane's burial, Laurie stood at the grave and spat on it. The pregnancy in the comics played out without the pharmaceutical subplot. Laurie told the group when she figured it out by counting missed periods, plainly and without the elaborate secrecy of the television version. There were no morning after pills, no attempted termination. Dale privately asked Rick whether the baby could be Shane's. Rick acknowledged that it was possible. He declined to discuss it further and accepted the child as his regardless. He was, in the comics, more immediately and unconditionally resolved about the question than his television counterpart. Kirkman confirmed in a Reddit AMA that Judith is biologically Shane's daughter in the comics, consistent with what Lincoln later confirmed for the show. The ambiguity was always intended to resolve the same way. Comic Laurie's death was a completely different kind of ending. In issue 48, during the governor's final assault on the prison, a woman named Lily Call shot Laurie in the back while she was fleeing with baby Judith in her arms. Laurie fell forward. Her body crushed and killed the infant. Both of them died in the same moment. Lily, who had not known she was shooting a nursing mother holding her baby, turned around and put her weapon against the governor's head and executed him. It is one of the most violent and sudden sequences in the comic's entire run, devoid of any of the preparation and chosen quality that Mazzara built into the television version. There was no final speech, no goodnight love. Just a bullet and a fall, and 2 bodies in the prison yard. Kirkman's commentary on Laurie across the deluxe editions is worth sitting with, because it reveals a creator genuinely puzzled by the gap between what he built and what readers received. In the commentary for issue 8, he wrote that it had always bothered him that readers never really liked Laurie, that he had always seen her as more sympathetic than they did, and that he never fully understood why his intentions didn't come through in the work. In the deluxe commentary for issue 37, he added that it always bothered him how harshly the fan base judged Laurie for the infidelity, and that personally, he would extend his spouse some understanding if the world ended and he appeared to be dead. He wished he had shown more of her regret and shame on the page. He felt he had failed to give readers access to the interiority that would have made her choices comprehensible, rather than simply frustrating. He also disclosed several scrapped plans for the character. She was originally going to divorce Rick in issue 18. In an earlier draft, she was going to be killed in the prison by the serial killer Thomas before any of the Governor material began. Pages of a prequel following Shane, Laurie, and Carl's evacuation from Kentucky to Atlanta were written and never published, and the original script for issue 17 had Rick striking Laurie in the face during an argument. Kirkman cut it because he decided it went too far. He settled for Rick screaming at her to shut up, which he acknowledged in commentary was still pretty harsh on its own. The gap between what Kirkman intended with Laurie and what readers received from her is, by his own admission, one of the creative failures of the comic run. He built someone he found sympathetic and produced someone the readers found infuriating. The television show had a different and more complicated version of the same problem. The production built someone they found fascinating and a significant portion of viewers found contemptible. The intent and reception were miles apart in both versions, and what lives in that gap is more interesting than either reading taken alone. Sarah Wayne Callies made a deliberate choice when she took the role of Laurie Grimes, an understanding that choice clarifies something about what the character was always supposed to be. She had come off Prison Break, where she played Sarah Tancredi, a character audiences had genuinely and warmly loved. She was conscious of what that success had done to her relationship, to her own choices as an actor. She was worried that she would begin making decisions based on what would maintain her likability rather than what would serve the story she was in. She wanted to disrupt that instinct, so she actively looked for a role audiences would struggle with. When she sat down with Frank Darabont to discuss Laurie, their agreement was explicit. They were not going to make the television version of a zombie apocalypse spouse. Laurie was not going to be a saint of the apocalypse, a supportive figure standing quietly behind her heroic husband. Callie's described their commitment as building the ugliest, dirtiest, most unlikable version of this character they could. She found this exhilarating. She had permission to go places that were uncomfortable and stay there. She also fought for Laurie's death when Darabont resisted it. Darabont believed there were narrative workarounds, ways to keep Laurie in the story without the sacrifice. Callie's was clear. Killing Laurie did something to Rick that was essential for the story and could not be accomplished any other way. When Mazzara took over as showrunner, he agreed. The death moved forward. Callie's and Mazzara spent 2 weeks refining the death scene dialogue. She had one specific request, that the scene carry genuine redemption. Not absolution, not a washing away of everything that came before, but a sense of Laurie having arrived somewhere true, with Rick and with Carl before the end. Mazzara, who had recently lost his own mother, brought personal weight to the writing that is visible in the final product. Callie's told him not to come to set on the day they filmed the boiler room sequence. She and the other actors would handle it. The deleted scene that didn't make the final cut is worth knowing about. At some point during the edit, there was a version of Rick's hallucination of Laurie that included a moment where Laurie's ghost transformed mid-vision into a rotted walker, a jump scare inside his grief. It was cut because it worked against the angelic quality the production wanted to give Rick's visions of her. What remained, the glimpse of her in white at the phone, the figure in the field, the dead woman who kept appearing to the man she had left in a prison, was softer and more elegiac. The deleted version would have made her haunting into something explicitly horrifying. Cutting it was the right choice. Stephen Yoon, speaking about Laurie after the character's death, offered the most compressed and accurate description of her function in the show. He said she was the bass guitar. You don't necessarily hear it. Pull it from the mix and everything falls apart. The fan response to Laurie Grimes was among the most sustained and vicious reactions any character on the show ever generated. And it started nearly immediately and never fully resolved even after her death. She appeared at the top of most annoying character list across every platform that ran them. TV Line published a ranking of The Walking Dead's most annoying characters with Laurie at number 1. The specific criticisms were numerous and varied. The car accident while reading a map in Season 2, which put her in danger and required the group to divert resources to retrieve her. The morning after pills swallowed and then immediately vomited, read as paralytic indecision that served no one. The kill Shane whisper in Triggerfinger followed closely by the windmill apology in Better Angels. Read by most viewers as a woman manipulating 2 men she had simultaneously in her orbit and then performing shock when the outcome arrived. The recurring perception that she told Rick what to do and then was furious when he did it. The sense that she created problems rather than solving them. Mazzara was asked about this directly by critics and refused to adjust the character for palatability. He said he was not going to manufacture false story beats to make Laurie more likeable. That was not the plan, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. There was something both defensive and principled in that statement. They had built a character who was supposed to be difficult, and they were not going to walk it back simply because the audience had decided they didn't like her. Kirkman went further in his commentary, and in public statements made years after the show ended. He connected the fan response to Laurie directly to a pattern in how television audiences have historically received complex women versus complex men. He pointed to Skylar White from Breaking Bad as the clearest and most discussed parallel. A woman who, by any honest accounting of that show's events, was behaving entirely reasonably in response to a husband who was systematically destroying their family and everyone around them, who received a level of audience vitriol that routinely outpaced what Walter White himself received, even at the height of his murderous career. Kirkman found the same dynamic with Laurie. Shane, who sexually assaulted her at the CDC, who murdered his own partner Otis by feeding him to walkers during Carl's medical crisis, who actively and openly plotted to kill Rick, consistently ranked lower on worst character lists than Laurie did. The asymmetry was documented and visible, and no one who pointed to it was being unreasonable. Sarah Wayne Callies made the same observation specifically about the parenting criticism, which was one of the most sustained threads in the fan response to the character. When Carl wandered away from the camp under Laurie's supervision, the fan commentary reliably blamed Laurie for negligence, for not watching her child, for being a bad mother. When Carl was shot under Rick's supervision during the deer-watching sequence in the Season 2 premiere, the commentary blamed Otis for firing an errant shot, blamed Shane for the frantic retreat from the school, blamed the general chaos of the situation. Almost no one blamed Rick for allowing his 8-year-old son to wander through an active deer hunting area in the middle of the apocalypse. Callies noted this disparity publicly, and she was right to. The parenting standard applied to Laurie was not being applied to Rick with anything resembling consistency. The gendered reading of the character's reception is well supported and important. But there is a second critique of Laurie that deserves honest engagement precisely because it does not come from misogyny, but from genuine attention to the writing of the show. The argument made by critics who are engaging seriously with the material rather than dismissing it is that Laurie's inconsistency is not the complexity of a realistic human being, but the inconsistency of a character whose motivation shifted based on what the surrounding plot required rather than what her own internal logic demanded. The morning after pill subplot, in which she swallowed them and immediately expelled them, and the show treated this as meaningful decision-making, falls into this category. The trigger finger whisper followed 5 episodes later by the windmill apology falls into it. The car crash, which produced no lasting consequences and appeared designed primarily to give other characters something to react to, falls into it. These are craft arguments rather than gendered ones. They are not saying that Laurie's behaviour was unforgivable or that the character concept was wrong. They are saying that specific moments in the writing did not serve the character's coherence, and that the cumulative effect of those moments was a figure who felt written around rather than written through. Kirkman's own deluxe edition admissions lend weight to this. He wanted to write a sympathetic, complicated woman, and acknowledged that he did not fully succeed in transferring his own understanding of her to the page. The gap between what he felt about Laurie and what readers receive from her is, in his own words, a failure he has spent years examining. What remained true across both the gendered critique and the craft critique is that the hatred Laurie generated exceeded what any honest accounting of her actions could support. She believed her husband was dead. She formed a relationship in that context with the person who kept her and her son alive. She ended it completely the moment her husband returned. She spent 2 seasons navigating the wreckage of decisions made under those circumstances, imperfectly and sometimes contradictorily, in a world that was constantly producing new, impossible situations faster than any person could adapt to them. She was the only major character whose death generated celebration in a significant portion of the audience. And then the death scene aired and most of that same audience went quiet. Kirkman noticed. Callies noticed. Mazzara noticed. The gap between what they built and what the audience received is the final hidden thing in Laurie's story. And it may be the most revealing one. Because it is not a secret about Laurie, it is a secret the audience kept from itself about what understanding and compassion it was willing to extend to a woman in an impossible situation versus what it was willing to extend to the men in identical ones. Let's end where the story ends. In the boiler room, in the dark, with Maggie holding a knife and Carl watching his mother run out of time, Laurie Grimes gave her son a set of instructions that became the moral framework he used for the rest of his life. Do what is right. If it feels wrong, don't do it. If it feels easy, don't do it. Don't let the world spoil you. Viewers who had spent 2 seasons cataloguing her failures sat with those words and found something they hadn't expected. Not a performance of virtue. Not a death scene designed to wash away prior sins and request a retroactive reassessment. Just a woman who understood exactly what she had done and what it had cost, giving her son the distilled version of the lesson she had learned by doing it. The affair was the easy thing. Leaning on Shane rather than sitting alone with her grief was easier. Keeping the assault secret rather than detonating the marriage was easier. Whispering into Rick's ear rather than confronting Shane directly or leaving the group or finding any other path was easier. The pills were an easier immediate response than the pregnancy. Each of the choices the audience found most damning was made toward the less painful option in the short term and the more painful option in the long term. Laurie had been living inside the long-term consequences of those choices for 2 full seasons. Her death scene was her making the opposite choice for the first and only time. Letting Maggie operate without anesthesia, in the dark, in a prison boiler room, in a building overrun with walkers, to give her daughter a chance at a life that Laurie would never see. That was not the easy thing. That was the hardest possible thing she could have done. And for the first time in her arc, the right thing and the hard thing were the same thing. Don't do the easy thing. She told Carl that because she was the person who had most consistently done the easy thing, and she had watched what it cost over years, and she wanted something different for him. He honoured it. When he took Siddiq in against Rick's instructions, he gave the same reasoning Laurie gave him. When he wrote letters to everyone he cared about before his infection took him. When he told Rick the future he wanted was peace rather than victory. Every significant moral choice Carl made after the boiler room was built on the framework Laurie left him. The show's most hated character produced its most thoughtful one. Not by being perfect or even good, but by being honest with him at the end about what she had gotten wrong and what she wanted him to do differently. There is something worth noting about the relationship between Laurie's death and Rick's breakdown that follows it. The phone calls in Season 3, Episodes 5 through 7, where Rick retreats into hallucination and conversations with voices from the dead, are the show's depiction of a man coming completely apart. The voice he needed most on the other end of that phone was Laurie's, and when she finally appeared in his vision, in the prison yard, standing in white in the light, she didn't speak. She just looked at him. She gave him her presence without demands or explanations. This is the version of Laurie that Rick had been unable to access while she was alive. The version without the complications and contradictions and the things she couldn't say. Death gave her the clarity she never quite had in life. Rick's grief gave him access to her in a form that was softer and more legible than the actual woman had ever been. There's something both beautiful and unfair about that. The real Laurie, the one who was complicated and private and sometimes got it wrong, was the one he couldn't fully reach. The ghost version, simple and luminous and uncomplicated, was the one he cried for. That distinction is the final thing Laurie's story leaves you with. She was never the character she appeared to be in the eulogy version. She was more human than that, which is both a smaller thing and a harder thing. The Walking Dead treated her as its problem character, its necessary friction, the complication in the love story at the centre of the show. What she was, if you lay the full picture out, was a woman doing her imperfect best in circumstances that had no good options, and hiding the things she hid not out of malice, but out of the ordinary human impulse to protect the things she still had from the damage of full disclosure. She was wrong to hide some of them. She was right to keep others. She was, across all of it, recognisably human in ways the show didn't always know how to frame, but Sarah Wayne Callies always knew how to play. That is the last thing she hid. Not from Rick, not from Shane, not from the audience, from herself, until she was out of time to keep hiding it. That she had the capacity to do the hard right thing. She just needed the world to remove every other option first. The quiet irony at the centre of Laurie's story is that the character the audience never forgave was the one who understood forgiveness and failure and the cost of choosing ease over difficulty more clearly than almost anyone else in the show. She just understood it too late to live differently. So she gave the understanding to the one person who still had time to use it. Good night, love. That's what she left behind. Not the affair, not the paternity, not the arguments and the contradictions and the 2 seasons of fan debate. Just those 2 words whispered into the dark like a door closing gently on everything that came before. And a mother's final voice shaping a boy who would go on to be one of the most morally coherent characters the show ever produced. If you want to keep going tonight, the next video is already on screen. We're spending a long time with Shane Walsh, and specifically with the question of whether he was genuinely in love with Laurie or whether he was in love with the version of himself that protecting her allowed him to be. It's a distinction that sounds small, but changes everything about how you read his arc. That one is on screen now. Sleep well.